As we look at this theme, heaven and earth, I'm just so excited to just share my heart and what the Lord's been revealing to me over the past week as I've been putting this message together, and just really excited to see what the Lord wants to do in our midst tonight. And really been praying, just even earlier today, just that God would put His Son on display before our eyes tonight. That God would, or that we, even as we look at this this reality in the Scriptures, that it would go beyond the Scriptures, and that we would actually have a glimpse of heaven on earth tonight. All right, well, let's turn in our Bibles. Well, you've already turned there. Ephesians chapter 1. Now, looking at the New Testament revelation. Quick review from last week. Last week we looked at basically an overview of the theme of heaven and earth and how God wants to bring the two of them together in the Old Testament. We really looked at we began last week in looking at Colossians chapter 1 verse 20, how Paul says that God reconciled all things in heaven and all things together, all things in heaven, all things in earth together through the death of His cross, or through the blood of His cross, and that in saying that He reconciled the two of them together, He is assuming that they were at one point united before the separation. And so we looked at Genesis chapter 1, and how it is that in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, how God created the heavens and the earth together in unity and not in separation with one another. And that God had never intended for there ever to be any opposition or separation between the two of them, but God's initial created order was for heaven and earth to be together. And we jumped down 2 verses and looked at how it was in the context of heaven and earth coming together that God said, "Let there be light." And we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 6, how it is that Paul clearly describes the light in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 as the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. And how it is that the purpose and the reason why God desired heaven and earth to be together and to create them together in unity was so that in that context He would display His divine attributes and show forth all that He is to His created order. Now, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 9 verse 9 and 10. Okay. The Apostle Paul writes, "Making known to us the mystery of His will, according to His purpose, which He set forth in Christ, a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in Him, things in heaven and things on earth." Okay, now Paul uses this word mystery here in Ephesians chapter 1 verse 9, and this word mystery is used 6 times in the book of Ephesians, five other times in 3 other times in chapter 3 and 1 time in chapter 6. And he describes this mystery quite a bit in the book of Ephesians. And I believe this is one of Paul's favorite themes to write about, is the mystery. He uses it quite often also in Colossians, and I believe in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that this mystery that he writes about, he writes about it quite often. Now he says this, the mystery of His will. Now, it's important to understand that this mystery that Paul is talking about here in Ephesians chapter 1, this is mysterious. This will is mysterious not because it is hard to understand or conceive of. Okay? That this mystery isn't mysterious because it's hard to understand or conceive of, but rather because in Ephesians chapter 3 verse 9 Paul says that because it is mysterious because He had hidden it from before the ages. And so that this is mysterious, this plan to bring heaven and earth together is mysterious because He has chosen to hide it in Himself from all the past generations. that God has chosen for prior to Christ to hide this plan in his holy heart and to hide it from all the past generations, to hide it from all those who are great in the Lord and great in faith, to hide it from all those kings, the great kings of Israel, and to hide it even from the prophets themselves. Now let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. Now 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, the context here is that Peter is stating that the prophets had received revelation from God, and they did not know exactly what it meant or how it was going to be fulfilled, but because of obedience, they wrote it down. And so Peter says this in verse 12. I just love this verse. This is awesome. He says, "It was revealed to them, the prophets, that they were not serving themselves, but you." You see, this is awesome, guys. That the Old Testament prophets wrote all the scriptures, and those that they didn't even they didn't fully understand, but they wrote them down out of obedience because of us and for us. Isn't that incredible? That God himself has hidden this mysterious plan. He's given little nuggets here and there throughout the Old Testament, how he was going to do it, but he had hidden it even from the greatest of the Old Testament prophets. Why? Because it was for us. It was hidden for us. Look at this in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 49. After the writer of Hebrews describes, it goes through the great hall of fame of faith and the believers who sacrificed much and gave themselves up as a drink offering unto God and lived with great faith. He makes this statement. After declaring the faithfulness of Abraham, the faithfulness of Isaac, and declaring of Moses and his faith, and declaring of Samson, he makes this statement, and as he makes this statement in verse 39. After he says that these ones that the world was not worthy of, these ones, he makes this statement, verse 39. "And all these, though commended through their faith, okay, did not receive what was promised." Okay, why didn't they receive what was promised them? Here's the answer. Since God has provided something better for us. That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. That God has chosen, and preserved something in his heart and hidden it from all the past generations for us. That even he has chosen all that which is seen in Hebrews 11, that men and women labored for and gave themselves for, was for our experience, was for our joy, was for our delight, that we, as the New Testament church, are the ones who are to receive and to experience the promises that Abraham labored for, that Moses labored for, that the prophets declared of, and the prophets poured themselves, their lives out for. That it was that they didn't receive the promise, but that it was preserved for us to receive. That he has chosen a specific group of people, a special group of people, to receive this revelation and this mystery. In Romans chapter 15, just before the apostolic prayer, he declares that the Old Testament scriptures were written for our encouragement. The scriptures in days gone by were written for us and for our sakes, for our enjoyment and for our encouragement. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul declares this. We were just reading this all week in our devotional passage. Verse 7. Okay. "We impart a secret, hidden mystery of God, which God has declared before the ages." Okay, so he says that he has hidden this wisdom of God, which he declared from before the ages. The New King James says the mystery of God. Why? For our glory. It was for our glory here and now, our glory as the New Testament church, that he has preserved these things for our experience and for our delight. He has chosen a special people for this revelation. Now, from what we observed from last week, this mystery that was hidden from all the past generations is not that God is not going to unite heaven and earth together, for the Old Testament scriptures are very clear. God's ultimate plan to reconcile heaven and earth, but rather the mystery of this revelation in Ephesians chapter 1, the mystery is the revelation of the means by which he is going to bring the two together. Now, we looked at this last week. It is very clear in the Old Testament that the Old Testament saints had revelation that God's ultimate plan and purpose was to reconcile the heavens and the earth together. It's very clear in the Old Testament. And so what is the mystery then? What's the mystery in Ephesians chapter 1? What's the plan of God's mystery that God has preserved in his heart for our experience? What's the mystery that he's preserved for us and for our enjoyment? Makes it very clear. Ephesians chapter 3, as he describes the mystery in verse 4. Mystery is Christ. The mystery is Jesus Christ himself. It's that through Jesus Christ, God is going to bring heaven and earth together, and he's going to unite the two of them and reconcile them through the person of Jesus Christ. Indeed, the revelation of the New Testament differs from the Old Testament not by introducing new doctrines or by removing old doctrines, nor is it grace versus law. But the revelation, is solely the revelation of Jesus. That his identity is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament doctrines, and all the promises are fulfilled through Christ. That the New Testament differs from the Old Testament not by offering new doctrines or new promises, or by removing old promises and old doctrines, but rather the difference between the Old and the New Testament, or you can say the Old and the New Covenant, which covenant simply means covenant. Testament simply means covenant. The difference between the two covenants is solely and simply Jesus Christ and the revelation of Jesus. That the New Testament doesn't remove the Mosaic system or the law, but rather what the apostles proclaimed and what Jesus Christ himself proclaimed was that he was the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies and promises. And so what the apostles proclaimed isn't that they removed the Old Testament, the old sacrificial system, but rather what they proclaimed is Christ is the fulfillment of it all. And when the apostles stood up and went out to all the nations and proclaimed the gospel, they weren't introducing new ideas or new doctrines to the Jewish community or bringing new revelations to the Gentile communities. But rather, they took the understanding of the Old Testament and they declared all the promises and all the commandments of God of the Old Testament are in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay, for example, at the end of Mark, Jesus, he commissions his apostles and he commands them to go into all the earth and to proclaim the forgiveness of sins. Now, the forgiveness of sins is a doctrine found much in the Old Testament. So it wasn't a new thing that they were preaching, but it was that they were preaching the forgiveness of sins in Jesus. He says, proclaim the forgiveness of sins in me. I am the means by which God forgives. The apostles in the Acts of the Apostles, as they proclaimed that God is going to raise the dead one day, that when the climax of all things, when God brings heaven and earth together, that he is going to raise all those who believe in Christ. He's going to raise them from the dead. That wasn't a New Testament doctrine. That was an Old Testament doctrine. It was very clear that the Old Testament saints believed that. But the difference and what got them in trouble was they declared that the resurrection of the dead is through the resurrection of Jesus. It's through Christ himself. And even Paul himself, when in Romans chapter 4, as he expounds upon and argues extensively how we are justified not by works, but by faith, he's arguing from the text in Genesis where it says Abraham was justified by faith. He's saying this was always how we were justified, was by faith. But the difference was that Paul proclaimed it's faith in Jesus Christ. This is the revelation that God has hidden from from before all the ages, and he's given to the church, revealed it to the apostles, and they have given it to the church, that Jesus Christ has come, and he has revealed the means by which he will fulfill all things in the person of his Son. I'm just thinking, last Sunday I was working last year at my church interning, and this Sunday with the College and Career Group, and this Sunday we were wrapping up with the leaders, and so we had the leaders over, and we just randomly got on the conversation of talking about how it is that we should present the gospel to the world. And so on one side of the spectrum, half the people were like, we should present love to people. Yeah, we should present a loving gospel. And then on the other side was, we should present a gospel that points out people's errors and sins. And so they were going back and forth on this, and I was writing on this, and I was thinking, I just stopped and I was like, the apostles, at the essence of what the apostles proclaimed, and really when they went to new places and proclaimed the truths of Christ and the gospel of the good news, the foundation of their message is very clear. It wasn't the love of God, and it wasn't pointing out errors in people's lives. The essence of their gospel was Jesus Christ alone. What the apostles proclaimed when they went from city to city, they didn't simply proclaim God is a God of love, or that God is a God who, what is usually proclaimed nowadays as a God who serves you, as a God who lives for your enjoyment, but rather what they proclaimed was Jesus Christ alone rules and reigns. Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead. Jesus Christ is Messiah. Jesus is the Christ that has been proclaimed and has been written about through the prophets, that he is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament scriptures. And this is the good news. Christ himself. It's not Christ and this. It's not Jesus and that. It's Jesus himself. And that's what the apostles proclaim. And that should be the foundation of our message as we proclaim to the world, solely Jesus Christ himself is better than everything else. Is Jesus himself. He is the good news. And in this context, the restoration of heaven and earth will be through the person and the identity of Jesus Christ. And more than that, the parallel to this passage in Ephesians chapter 1, 9 and 10, we looked at last week, Colossians chapter 1, verse 20, that through him, through Jesus, he, the Father, has reconciled all things in heaven, all things on earth, together through the blood of his cross. That it's through, not only through the identity of Christ, but it's through the work of Christ. It's through the death of the Messiah that he would restore all things in heaven and on earth. You proclaim that and you tell that to a Jew, like, God is going to restore all things in heaven and earth. He's going to bring restoration to all things through your Messiah's death. Well, first off, they didn't have any revelation that the Messiah would die, right? But that God would restore all things through the death of their king. First off, that's one of those things that their jaws would drop down. Like, what the heck are you talking about, man? The death of our king is going to bring about the restoration of all Where do you get this from? What are you talking about? That's crazy. And it's seemingly so weak that the death of a man is going to bring about the restoration of all things. That's crazy. Now you think of, thinking back to what we were talking about last week, Adam in the garden, heaven and earth were united together. And in that context, Adam had perfect union with God. But Satan comes along, a little temptation. Oh, what's a little sin, right? I'll have a little fruit, right? It's just a little fruit. I mean, we know God hates sin, but how bad does God hate sin, right? And then, I mean, how bad does God really hate a little fruit? I mean, what's a little lie, right? Does God really hate it? I mean, is it really that bad? And so they take Eve takes the fruit. So does Adam. Beloved, when Adam and Eve took that sin, that small act of disobedience, guys, that wasn't a small thing. Guys, when they took that fruit, there was a separation between heaven and all creation was divided at that point. And the cosmos, I believe, began to shake. And things were in opposition with each other through one small act of obedience. But this is good news today. Romans chapter 5 declares through one act of disobedience, many were made unrighteous. But he makes the parallel, through one act of righteousness, many were made righteous. That through that seemingly small, weak man on a cross, 33-year-old carpenter, condemned as a murderer, or condemned as dying the death of a criminal, Philippians 2 says. As they looked at him on the cross, bleeding and dying, mocking him, spitting upon him. So weak, so insignificant. When he said, "It is finished," and he yielded up his spirit, Calvary began to shake, the grounds began to shake, and the heavens were darkened, and that there was an earthquake when Christ died, and that he himself, when he died, he tore the veil between the holy place and the most holy place in two. Now, a lot of times we think, oh, a veil, a little curtain thing, right? God tore it in half, right? That's so significant, right? Until you understand that historically, the veil between the Holy of Holies and the holy place was as thick as a man's hand. It'd probably take about 6 to 8 people have to part that veil. And Christ, he tore that veil in two. And that he undid, in one act of obedience, he undid all that Adam did in all the generations. He undid it all, and he shook the heavens and the cosmos when Christ died. He brought all of heaven and all of earth together through his death. That seemingly weak thing, that thing that Paul declared, it's foolishness to the world. Christ crucified, the Messiah dead, foolishness was the most powerful act and far surpasses, I believe, Genesis 1 in the creation, as he brought all things in heaven and earth together. Okay. Turn with me to John chapter 1. Now, last week, we went through the overview of the Old Testament. And we observed from last week how God appeared, or how Abram met Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. And Abram gets the revelation that God is the possessor of heaven and earth. That he gets the understanding that God has not forsaken the earth, but he holds the two of them in his hand, and that I believe it was at this time that he had the revelation that God was going to restore heaven and earth once again. He was going to bring the two of them together. And it was at that time, I believe, Hebrews 11:10, I think it's Hebrews 11:10, where it says Abraham was looking for a city, the heavenly city, not made by human hands, but heaven itself. Now, Abram would have proclaimed that all of his life and proclaimed it to his sons and daughters. And we read later on in Genesis 28, verse 12, how Jacob, the son of Abraham, who heard the declaration that God hasn't forsaken the earth, God hasn't forsaken his creation. He's going to bring the two of them together again. He goes to Mount Bethel. He lays his head on the pillow. Not a pillow, on a rock or something. He lays his head down, and because he was on the run because his brother was going to kill him, right? And he's on the mountain, and it says Genesis 28, verse 12. And behold, he had a dream, and he saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, and angels ascending and descending on the ladder. That Jacob, it was revealed to Jacob that God, Abraham was right. I am still the possessor of heaven and earth. And more than that, I will bring heaven and earth together. And even more than that, there is a connecting point right now between heaven and earth. And so we turn here to John chapter 1. Okay? In John chapter 1, Nathanael comes to Jesus, or Philip comes to Nathanael and declares, Nathanael, we found the Messiah, the awaited one. And Nathanael's like, okay, who's this guy? Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael says, Nazareth? Has anything good ever come out of Nazareth before? He doesn't argue. He just says, just come see. Just come see Nazareth. No, not Nazareth. Nathanael. Just come see him. Comes to him. Jesus says to him, I saw you. I saw you in the other city. You're sitting underneath a fig tree. Nathanael's eyes are open. Whoa, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. How could you? Jesus is like, okay, I gave you one word of knowledge about seeing you in another city, and you believe so easily. And Jesus makes this statement to Nathanael in verse 51. He says, you believe so easily? Guess what? You are going to see the heavens open and angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, this is a statement, I believe, that, first off, Nathanael this is a jaw-dropper moment, and all the listeners would have just been, what did he just say? Jesus is directly referring back to Genesis 28:12, where it says that there was a ladder, a connecting point between heaven and earth, and angels ascending and descending upon it. And Christ himself is proclaiming before all the listeners, I'm the connecting point between heaven and earth. I'm the connecting point. That ladder in Jacob's dream, it was me. And you're going to see the heavens open, and there are going to be angels ascending and descending upon me, the Son of Man. Takes this up a level. John chapter 2. John chapter 2, verse 19, 21. He's talking to the Jews, and he says to the Jews, want to know who I am? Tear down this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And the Jews, what are you talking about, man? It took our fathers 46 years to build this temple. Tear it down, and you're going to build it up in 3 days? And then the Apostle John, he gives commentary to this statement Jesus made. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Now, we looked at last week how that ladder, that connecting point between heaven and earth was then made, or was the tabernacle and was the temple, that the place that Israel made to commune with God, the Holy of Holies, was a connecting point between heaven and earth. It was a place where heaven and earth became one again. And so we looked at last week how the nation of Israel continually would replicate, would mirror the realities of heaven in their building of structures and building the tabernacle and the temple. And so the temple, which is the connecting point, the fulfillment of Genesis 28:12, the connecting point between heaven and earth, John says it's Jesus. Jesus is the temple. Now, thus, Jesus is the very embodiment of the temple, the connecting point between heaven and earth. Just as he stated in John chapter 1, verse 51, but here we see it at a whole nother level, that he himself is the place of worship now. Now, therefore, the New Testament does not remove the temple, but rather states that Christ has become the very temple. We thus worship towards no earthly temple, but to a man. That Christ himself is the point that we are to worship to. We don't go to a temple anymore. And not that the New Testament removed the temple, but rather Christ has become the very temple, and we worship towards a man now. Now he who dwelt in heaven condescended from his high dwellings to dwell and to take upon himself an earthly body, making himself the heavenly man. 1 Corinthians 15:48 in the New King James says, Jesus is the heavenly man. Okay, so he who dwelt in heaven, more than that, the centerpiece of heaven itself, Christ, prior to his incarnation, he condescended, he came and he became a man. He is the heavenly man. Okay, I get this. He literally, okay, Jesus, this isn't symbolic. Jesus literally embodies the reality of heaven and earth in his identity. He is the God-man. His identity, literally, he is both God himself and he is both man. In his identity, he literally is the connecting point between heaven and earth. He embodies both realities. Now, though this is true that Christ has removed the temple, now through fulfilling the temple, the earthly temple, this does not mean that we are not called to mirror heaven on earth. Now, we looked at last week how Israel mirrored heaven on earth through the tabernacle and through the temple. Now, if Christ is the embodiment of the temple, does that mean we should stop mirroring heaven on earth? Should that mean we shouldn't try to bring heaven on earth or something like that? For Christ himself says in Matthew 6, 9 and 10, pray then like this. He says, this is how you pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That even in the New Testament, in this new covenant, that there is still in his church to be this mirroring of heaven on earth. And we are to pray this way. Now, just because there's not a physical temple on the earth, that does not mean that we should not mirror the realities of heaven on earth. Now, because there's no temple on earth, or there's no tabernacle, there's no physical structure that we direct our worship towards. Therefore, we are not called to replicate or to mirror the structure of heaven. Okay, just as, especially in the tabernacle of Moses, we looked at last week how Moses was commanded to mirror the structure of heaven, that which was happening around God's throne, and they mirrored it on the earth. That because there's no temple, the mirroring of the structure or the reality, the things in heaven isn't necessary because there's no temple. There's no structure on the earth. But his church is called to mirror and replicate the expression of heaven. the expression of what is happening around God's throne is to be mirrored on the earth. How the angels respond to God, how they look at him, and as they respond day and night, night and day, and as they explode in exuberant worship towards God. We're supposed to replicate that on the earth. We're supposed to mirror that on the earth. And the reality and the expression and the enjoyment that's happening around God's throne, that is to be mirrored on the earth. As in heaven, God's will is fulfilled perfectly, and righteousness flourishes in heaven. And there's not an ounce of unrighteousness or evil in heaven. We're to mirror the reality of the righteousness of heaven on the earth. And because there is righteousness in heaven, there is no sickness in heaven. And so he's saying that let it be that righteousness would flourish on the earth. Let it be that healing would flourish on the earth, just as it's like in heaven. And more than that, mirror on heaven, on earth, how they worship around the throne. Mirror on earth how it is that they behold me with such excitement and with such joy. They sing to me day and night. Now, when Christ ascended to the heights of heaven, where he dwelt prior to his incarnation, and to his enthroned rest, having victory over his enemies, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 20-22, he ascended not in the same likeness as before, for when he ascended as a man to the divine throne, thereby taking the earthly dwelling into the heavenly dwelling. Therefore, we have not been given access into an earthly tabernacle or an earthly temple, which was only mirroring the true things. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 23, 24, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. But into heaven, the heavenly temple itself, in the true tabernacle itself. And the Old Testament saints, they had access to the earthly tabernacle. They had access to the earthly temple. But in this new covenant, Christ himself has become the temple, and he has ascended not into that which is made by hands, the earthly things, but he has ascended into heaven itself. Now, looking at the book of Hebrews chapter 6, the writer of Hebrews makes this statement. Now, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, a hope that enters behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. What he's saying is that we have followed Christ to where he has ascended. We have followed Christ to where he has been seated, and that Christ has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. Now later on in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 1 through 6, the writer of Hebrews describes the earthly tabernacle, the order that Moses gave. As we looked at last week, how there were 3 sections in the tabernacle of Moses. And the writer of Hebrews, he only highlights 2 of those sections, the holy place and the most holy place. The holy place where only the high priest could go, and the most holy place where only the high priest could go once a year. And the writer of Hebrews, he describes that the priests and the high priest would go from one holy place to another holy place. Okay? They would go from the holy place into the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, depending on what translation you have. Okay. Now, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11. Now, this is paralleling to what he had written in the beginning of Hebrews chapter 9, verse 1 through 6. Okay, within the book of Hebrews, there are multiple parallels, and it's a very theologically dense book. I love it. It's great. So he's paralleling this, and he says this: "But when Christ appeared as a high priest," okay, as a high priest, just like in verse 1 through 6, as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, okay, he has ascended to the more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. He entered once for all, just as the high priest entered once a year, so it is Christ ascended once for all into heaven, into the holy places. That always used to get me. Why are you saying holy places? I mean, what are you talking about? Writer of Hebrews? Holy places. But he's referring to the earthly holy places, saying Christ ascended to the true holy places. He went, just as the high priest would go from one holy place to another holy place, so Christ entered into the real tabernacle, the real temple, where he entered into not which was made by hands, but that which was made by God himself and constructed by God himself, the true and living tabernacle. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24 makes it explicit where Christ went when he ascended. For Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, okay, not into the holy places in the tabernacle or in the temple, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. You get the connection? Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19 declares, we followed Christ where he had gone, and we went behind the curtain. Okay? The curtain isn't the earthly curtain. The curtain or the veil is the heavenly veil. Why? Because Christ ascended into heaven itself, and we followed him there, and we went in the true holy place. We went into the true and the living most holy place. And then Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19 makes it explicit. And he says this, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places through the blood of Jesus, the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, again, through the curtain, that is his flesh. That God, through Christ, through the embodiment of heaven and earth, and through the true earthly and the true temple on earth, Christ himself, the connecting point between the two of them, he ascended on high, and he brought us with him when he ascended. When he ascended on high, he made a way for us to enter into the holy places with him. In the climax of the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 22, remember, just between chapter 10, chapter 12, it said Abraham was looking for a heavenly city. And here it says in verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God. We have come to the city, the place that Abraham was searching for on the earth. We have come to the heavenly dwelling that Abraham was seeking as he continued on, and he was faithful to what God has commanded him to do in seeking for a homeland. He was seeking for heaven itself. We have come to the place that Abraham was seeking. We have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to the immeasurable angels, to the festival of gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God himself, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling of the blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. A.W. Tozer says this: when Christ ascended, we ascended with him. When Christ was enthroned, we were enthroned with him. And right now, humanity is enthroned at the right hand of God. I just love that statement Tozer made. It's just, humanity is enthroned at the right hand of God. Ephesians chapter 2, I think it's verse 6, declares, we have been seated in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Where's the seat? We're enthroned with him. When Christ was ascended on high, and he sat enthroned at that great enthroning rest, as he sat down, the Father made all of his enemies a footstool for him, and he rested. And that we have ascended to the place where Christ has gone, not into the earthly tabernacle, but to the true and the living tabernacle. Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 that our citizenship is not on the earth, but it's in heaven with Christ, hidden with him. Okay, now in closing, I want us just to take a glimpse at the reality of heaven. Take a glimpse at the true tabernacle. I just want to look at Isaiah chapter 6. Now, Isaiah the prophet, he's taken up into heaven, and he beholds God seated on his throne and the scenery around his throne. He says, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, or high and lofty, as the NASB says. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. One called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The foundation of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And then Isaiah cried, woe is me, I'm ruined. I'm ruined, I'm destroyed. That's what he's actually saying in the Hebrew. I'm destroyed. I don't even know what to do with myself. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Now, first off, we see here in Isaiah chapter 6, first off, the prophet parallels 2 things. In verse 1 and verse 5, he makes a parallel between kings. He says, in the year King Uzziah died. Verse 5, he says, I saw the King, the Lord of hosts. You see, Isaiah, he's taken up into heaven in the time of calamity. When the earthly king has died, he gets a glimpse of the true living king who really holds Israel in his hands. We then see he who is high and lifted up, the train of his robe filling the heavenly temple. Now I believe that in Isaiah chapter 6, when the prophet is talking about the train of his robe filling the temple, now this is the place where we're gathered around, where we have ascended on high, that we're what Isaiah is seeing in Isaiah chapter 6, we have been brought right before the throne and seated in that place with Christ. And he says, in that place, the train of his robe fills the entire temple. I believe what he's saying is that the train of his robe is speaking symbolically of the knowledge of who he is filling the entire temple. That in heaven, right now, that this isn't, I guess, we talk about heaven all the time, and guys, this isn't a fairy tale. Okay, there is a real place where God right now, as I'm talking, is enthroned, and it's more real than this pulpit. It's more real than the chair that you're sitting on. God is enthroned on high, and there are myriads of angels, according to Daniel 7 and Revelation chapter 5, around his throne, and they are worshiping him day and night, night and day, continually, millions of angels around his throne right now. I love to think of that when I'm feeling kind of dull, and just like I wake up in the morning, I'm like, oh, I just don't feel anything. I'm not a morning person. I think when I'm not feeling anything, There is a place where there are millions of angels worshiping him day and night with all their energy. And that place is shaking. That place that was not made by man, but was made by God himself, shakes at the voice of the seraphim as they cry, holy, 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 as the millions of angels, as Psalm 28 declares, everyone in your temple cries glory. Millions of angels at one time declare glory and declare holy before the Lord. It shakes the temple. This place is real. This heaven's not a fairy tale. God is actually seated on a throne, and his reign in heaven is more real than anything Justin Trudeau can ever do in Canada, more real than whatever Obama had ever done in the United States. He is truly ruling and reigning, and he's not a fairy tale. He is absolute reality, and his dwelling and his enthronement is true and real. That in heaven, the train of his robe and the knowledge of who he is, it fills the entire temple. That there is not one person in heaven that can escape the knowledge, the weighty, like a robe weighing down on someone. I mean, that's got to be a heavy robe that's filling the whole temple, right? It's weighing down on everyone. The weighty revelation of who God is weighs down on everyone in the heavenly temple. And this weighty knowledge of who he is that's inescapable in heaven, it fills all of heaven. All the angels, the millions around the throne, they experience and they universally, everyone in heaven universally sees the knowledge and the holiness of who God is. Everyone in heaven sees the knowledge of who Jesus Christ is. I love this. In heaven, there are no opinions. There are no ideas about the identity of Jesus. Okay? The angels around the throne, I think he's like this. I think he's like that. I think he was a great prophet. Oh, really? I think he's a good man. He's on his throne. He's sustaining all things, and he's allowing us to breathe right now. I wonder what the full unveiled revelation of who he is displayed to all the angels around the throne. And they look at him unveiled, and in heaven, there are no opinions about who he is. The revelation of who he is spreads throughout heaven, and it weighs down on everyone, and everyone's response in heaven is glory. Everyone's response in heaven is holy. Everyone's response in heaven is to lay down on that sea of glass and to declare who he is, and not debate theology with people. I think this, I think that. No, they lay prostrate before him in his glory. And in heaven, he is worshipped monotheistically, meaning that he is the only one in heaven worshipped. There's not two people in heaven worshipped. He himself is worshipped in heaven. He himself is the only one seen. He himself is the only one enthroned in heaven. And he is, therefore, because his revelation weighs so heavily upon the heavenly temple and upon all those surrounding his throne, he is then worshipped incessantly, continually, day and night, night and day. They never cease, and they never get bored by saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And as the seraphim flew and beheld and burned before his glory. The word seraphim, most of us know. The word seraphim literally means burning ones, that these angels around God's throne are on fire. The angels around the throne, as they burn before God, as they behold and burn. That's their occupation. They behold God and they burn. That's all they do. They declare, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. They worship him without end, without ceasing. With jubilee, sing with joy, with happiness. Now, I do not think when the creatures around the throne of God, when the seraphim declare that holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory, I don't think that they're saying that the earth presently is filled with his glory. Because in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, the prophet declares that the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. That the earth will one day be filled with the knowledge of who God is. And so, even as they're around the throne and as they look and they peer into God, as they behold and burn, as they look into the identity of who Christ is, and they peer into all of his attributes. When they look into who he is and his personality, they also gaze into his plans and purposes in the future. Because whatever God does is who he is. He can never act outside and contradict who he is. Whatever he does reveals who he is. And as they peer into God, they look into his plan of restoration. And they are declaring, holy, holy, holy is the Lord, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And as they are prophesying Isaiah 11, verse 9, that the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. They are prophesying, and even as they say this, even as they declare this continually, I believe they are longing for heaven and earth to come together. As they declare that the earth is filled with his glory, and as they prophesy this, even the seraphim around the throne are longing for heaven and earth to come together and be united with one another. They're longing for the reconciliation and the restoration of heaven and earth. Thus the seraphim are prophesying at the climax of all things, as the revelation of Christ will be universally beheld, monotheistically beheld as the only God, and incessantly worshipped on the earth one day. They are declaring around God's throne that the earth, that which is taking place in heaven. You see in, I forget which verse it is. I didn't actually turn to it. Isaiah chapter 6, and he says, in verse 1, he says, the whole temple, the train of its robe fills the temple, okay? It fills the temple, and then they declare, the earth is filled with his glory. You see? You see what he's saying there? It's the same Hebrew word, or the same root word. The heavenly temple is filled with his robe, and the earth is going to be filled with his glory. As the heavenly temple is filled with his glory in the train of his robe, and the revelation of who he is weighs so heavily upon everyone universally in heaven, and everyone sees the only one seated and enthroned over all things, and they worship him day and night, night and day. They are declaring, and they are prophesying that glory that is filling the temple is going to fill the earth one day. Just as it is in the heavenly temple, it will be on the earth. Just like Jesus taught us to pray, hallowed be my name, on earth as it is in heaven. Just like they sing, holy, holy, holy around the throne, pray that it would be on the earth as well. And that there is a day coming, Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14, where the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That there's a day coming when Christ is going to descend from heaven. He's going to split the skies, and he's going to come down, and he's going to establish his throne of glory in Jerusalem. And he's going to come, and in that day, there's going to be no opinions about who he is. The Muslims aren't going to rise up, oh, I think Jesus is like this. No, they're going to be terrified of who he is when he comes. When he descends in all of his glory, he's going to come down, and he's going to fill, and he's going to flood all the earth globally, every city. Edmonton, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, U.S., every nation is going to be filled with the weighty knowledge of who Jesus Christ is, just as it is in heaven. There's going to be no opinions about who Jesus Christ is in that day. You know, the leaders of the earth, the kings of the earth, like in Psalm 2, in that day, they're going to have no opinions. I think he's like this. I think he's like that. He's going to confront the earth with the knowledge of who he is. The God-man himself, he's going to come, and the knowledge of the glory of God is going to fill the earth, just like the waters cover the sea. I like to think of it as, you see a fishbowl, you see a fishbowl, and then usually there's like a city in a fishbowl, right? And, you take You take a bowl of water, you just fill that city in that fish bowl with that water, and it sinks into every crack. It goes into every hole. The water's inescapable. And when it floods, it gets into everything. It gets into every crack, every hole, even the smallest ones. It's inescapable. There's a day coming when the knowledge of God is going to fill the earth, and it's inescapable. The people of the earth who rave against Christ, they can do nothing about it. It's unstoppable. Christ is coming, and he's going to fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory, and every eye is going to see him one day. Every eye is going to see him. In Philippians chapter 2, every knee is going to bow before him out of their own will or by him of Psalm 2, who holds the nations in his hand with a rod of his iron, and he will break their knees with a rod of iron. And they will bow out of their own will or out of his judgments. And Christ himself is going to come. Christ himself is going to be worshiped by everyone universally on the earth. And guess what? It's not a fairy tale. Guys, this is reality. This is reality. Christ himself is coming to the earth, and heaven is going to invade earth and every sphere of society, and every king is going to come before him. Psalm 72, every king is going to come before him. Every king is going to bow, and every king is going to lay before him on the pavement, and every king is going to bring him gifts. Every king is going to be laid low. And Isaiah chapter 2 declares, the lofty prides of man will be humbled. That which is exalted among men shall be brought low. And God himself, Jesus Christ, will be seen as glorious and will be seen as awesome. And all the earth will actually, when we sing, like this morning, when we were singing, all the earth is going to sing your praise. All the earth is going to sing your glory. Guys, that's not cool, just cool words on a screen. That's reality. That's where this whole thing is going. Every nation, every city is going to sing continually, and they're going to behold the glory of Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, Maria, you want to? Let's just stand up. The heavenly city in the New Jerusalem. When it comes to the earth, when heaven is united with earth once again, it says in Revelation 21, verse 23, there is going to be no need for a sun, no need for a moon. Why? Because the face, the glory of God is going to fill the entire city. The glory, the light of the glory of God, just like it did in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, as the light broke out in the context of heaven and earth, light is going to break out in the union between heaven and earth and the reconciliation between the two of them. And the entire city is going to be lit up by the face of God. And its lamp is going to be the lamb. And it's the face of Jesus Christ that is going to fill and is going to light up the entire earth. That's awesome, guys. This is not a fairy tale. Christ is coming to the earth, and this gives me hope, guys. This is hope. Hey, guys, if things feel like are just spinning out of control in the world and in the nations, right? Guys, things aren't spinning out of control. God has a sovereign plan, and no human will stop his plan. Christ is coming to the earth. He will descend, and heaven will come down to earth, and he will bring all the lofty prides of man down low to the ground, and he alone will be exalted, and he alone will be worshipped. So, Father, we look to that day, God. You say, God, there's no one like you, God. God, we look to that day when Christ will come. Say, it's our great hope, God, when Christ will come. And he will subdue all his enemies, God. And he will remove all sin, all unrighteousness, all evil. When Christ himself will descend, Father, and every eye will see him, God. Every Muslim, God, will look upon that man, God, and there will be no opinions about your son in that day, God. Christ will be exalted, God. All the peoples of the earth will declare the God-man, Jesus Christ. All the peoples of the earth will declare, and all the Jews will declare, Yahweh incarnate, the God whom our fathers worshipped, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac,
And the God of Jacob, God, we exalt you today and say, oh, we long for that day when you yourself will come and you yourself will flood all the earth with the knowledge of the glory of who you are.